Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everybody. This is the Living Crystal webinar for Europe on the 8th of March. And we have an initial question. Are there any negative or even positive side effects if using or practicing with the Living Crystal? Jake?
Yeah, so there are numerous positive side effects when working with the Living Crystal device. However, depending on your intentions going into the experience of the Living Crystal, if you are already experiencing agitation or you're not in a good headspace, the Living Crystal device can enhance any energy you put into the device. Now, we found through trial tests that if you're working with a Living Crystal device with that is plated with gold, or if you're using a specific crystal that tends to work with negative energy to begin with, like selenite, that tends to buffer that effect. So in general, it's best to come into and practice the Living Crystal device when you're already in a good headspace, and so that it's amplifying and working off the top from that. Any additions, Bob?
Yeah. When we ship the devices out, you get two links to two exercises, one of which is sometimes referred to as the secret smile technique. And what this does is this works to put your emotional and energetic background into a very positive sensation and therefore mind state. So that helps to buffer that. The exercise itself takes about 5 minutes to learn how to do. It's pretty quick and basically consists of consciously moving certain sensations and emotions through the body. At the end of that, you combine all of those, you end up feeling great, hence the term secret smile. And then that works as an excellent warm-up, if you will, for working with the device. Are there any ways or methods of practicing with the Living Crystal to help amplify visualization skills? Well, Jake, I think you can speak to this. Can you speak to the question, Jake, about visualization?
Yeah, so, there are tons of ways you can use the Living Crystal device for visualization. One of which is very much like the classic Kasina exercise that is used in more Vedic practices, where you can work with the Living Crystal device with your eyes slightly open, not fully open, but just very slightly open, and hold a soft gaze, peripheral gaze, whilst working with the device. So for example, here I have my Living Crystal unit right here. And I can just practice with it, turn it on. And so then what I could do is I can start kind of softly gazing at the device, opening up my peripheral vision, and then tune into the Living Crystal device's energy. Now, the very first thing I may notice and start to tune into when working with the Living Crystal device is the vital effect of the energy, right? Feeling the physical sensations I am sensing in the space between the Living Crystal device and my hands and my palms. Now, our palms and our fingers are some of the most sensitive parts of our body to pick up and tune into energy. So when tuning with the Living Crystal device, you can play and fluctuate with your hands and tune it to a spot that feels comfortable. Now, you can also use the Living Crystal device for the building ball exercise, which is another fantastic exercise for learning sensitivity and conductivity to energy. Once you are developing sensitivity to energy through the feeling gate, which is the easiest way to first access and connect with the Living Crystal, then it's much, much easier to connect with it through the visual gate. So once you're feeling it through your hands kinesthetically, then you may start to notice and feel that there are an outline or layers and some sort of vibratory feeling to it. And the visuals may also act that out that way as well. Now, if you are familiar with astral energy, that's where you may have more vivid visions come from the living crystal device or from a meditative practice. So the vital energy is going to look more like a silvery outline. Now, when you're working with it at the astral level, part of that's going to depend on you and the visualization skills you already have. And so that's if we're working with the raw, like, energy. So if you just want to work with it closed eyes and then tune into the living crystal device, it can help you tune into a specific image or picture that you're trying to tune into or maintain a solid fixtured form. One difficulty a lot of people have when they're doing any type of visualization exercise is having a more fixtured, solid image that's stable with whatever they're trying to visualize. The living crystal device provides a energy signature and provides an anchor point for you to have much more stable visualizations, which will help you in any type of meditative, yogic, or esoteric exercise, since that's fundamentally the foundation for any of those types of practices. Whether you're into Chinese medicine or yogic arts, the living crystal will help you with the process of visualizing each step of the way to help you succeed with those respective systems. Anything to add there, Bob? Let's see.
What I would say is you have to keep in mind the living crystal is essentially an amplifier. So whatever energetic or meditative modality you use in your normal practice, it's going to improve that. Now, as a functional matter, most of what the living crystal does is at kind of the mental level of existence. So for a lot of out-of-body type experiences, it works exceedingly well. We know this additionally, having worked with some relatively high-level remote viewers, that they've gotten really good results as a result of this. Additionally, it does generate a little bit of what is sometimes called astral or sensation-based energy. Now, this is quite interesting because in conventional yogic theory, you have to have a physical body and breath to generate that kind of energy. Interestingly enough, the living crystal does this, and it's not a living, breathing body. So exactly how that's happening, we're not exactly sure. We have put the device in a laboratory setting, and the only radiation it's generating is a little bit of a magnetic field, but the magnetic field generated by the home computer you use or your handheld device actually generates a much stronger one than the living crystal does. So it's clearly generating something that is similar enough to what the body generates on its own that it allows you to do things much easier. I like to make the analogy of conventional yogic practice is the equivalent of body weight exercise, and that works great. But the addition of the living crystal is very similar to using a barbell system. It's just additional production or resistance that over time through the stress adaptation cycle allows you to improve your results. So yeah, man, just whatever system of meditation you use, simply use the device in your proximity. And usually within a few minutes to a few days, most people notice a pretty significant improvement.
Has anyone ever tried putting a diamond on it, and what happens? Anything to add to that, Bob?
I have not used a diamond specifically, but what I can say is the books that are written on sacred stones and this kind of thing are largely correct. What we found is that the living crystal, if you place a stone on top of it, essentially amplifies the effect that is normally generated by stones. Now, what I have done is I've put a synthetic ruby on top of it, and its effects were greatly amplified over the use of a ruby by itself. Now, this was curious because, again, it was a synthetic stone. It turns out, as long as the stones are properly produced in a lab, they tend to work pretty well. So what I would say is what we need to do, I guess, is get our hands on a synthetic diamond and see what happens. But my suspicion is you would have the same effect you would get from a diamond in general.
see.
So the question is, what happens if one works with Akasha or loads a stone and put it on top of it? Jake, here you go.
So whatever energy you tend to input into the stone or crystal you're working with tends to get amplified when working with the living crystal device. Now, like Bob mentioned earlier, we're not like it generates its own field respectively. And if you work with the Akasha or have that ability to work in a deep meditative state that facilitates Akasha, then this device amplifies that considerably. Now, whether you are able to also mentally transfer into the stone for an Akashic-like effect to happen through the process of samadhi is up to the ability of a practitioner. Now, what I can say is that the living crystal will help you and create a bridge for that exercise, but it's not going to do all the legwork to be able to mentally transfer into an object and create that bridge and go into the Akashic trance through concentration. So we could go into the different forms of Akasha respectively, like letter E or letter umlaut U or umlaut O, or we could go there. So yeah. Any thoughts on that, Bob?
Absolutely. Amethyst in general works pretty well for this, for generating earthly Akasha. Now, in this case, what's interesting again is the stones don't have to be very big. And that was a big surprise. It turns out that whatever these things do to mimic these different energetic forms, size is not much of a limitation. Now, if you load a stone, it's much more effective. And that's one of the curious things about the living crystal, is that even if you're just using a plain glass ball like this, if you push a given energetic form into the ball, the living crystal device begins to mimic that energy very effectively. Also, it has an interesting effect of dropping people into trance relatively quickly. And this has caused us to reevaluate what is required to perform single-pointed concentration exercises. You know, the conventional view on this was that this was a training effect, but it took several weeks for people to learn how to focus their mind, basically. Well, as it turns out, a big part of that is focusing your attention requires a certain kind of energy that the body doesn't have much of. And the living crystal, interestingly enough, generates more of that energy, or something close enough to it, that most people can engage in single-pointed focus within a handful of sessions, versus normally it taking a month to 6 weeks. So yeah, it's a pretty interesting piece of equipment.
Yeah. And the effects of the living crystal device with working with different forms of Akasha vary significantly. Here we have the living crystal device with amethyst on top of it. And to me, it reflects more of the umlaut A feeling or letter E, right? Depending on how you want to tune into it and pull energy through. So I hope this kind of gives you some base idea of how the amethyst can kind of help you tune into the Akasha feeling and energy more, especially if it's not an energy you're not quite yet familiar with. Using amethyst with the living crystal may be one of many different effective bridges to start getting into the Akashic trance and the Akashic feeling. So don't know if John is effective, is like an advanced practitioner of different Kabbalistic letters or forms, but you can work with different letters respectively with the living crystal device, and the effects will be much more pronounced. Let's say if you're working with umlaut O, then you're going to find that the sensation of Akasha, as opposed to feeling solely like a separation of the bodies and being tranced, it's gonna feel more of a raising effect, and your consciousness and your point of awareness will start elevating, as will your energy centers just go up your spine, up, and you'll notice yourself effectively going through the process of transforming lower energies into higher energies and past your crown into more finer and finer forms of light. And this isn't really a process. It's a natural process of the energy itself. And the living crystal, once you initiate that energy for even a few minutes, then the living crystal device is going to hold that umlauto energy, and that process of raising energy through you is going to naturally occur and keep proceeding. And it's not something you have to facilitate. It's going to enact and work and pull that caustic frequency through on its own. So be careful with this, because it can make one more lazy for practice. And so it's good to know that this is an amplifier, and this is also something that can run these energies independently of your own will once you set them in place, and once you go from the inertia and go from 0 to 15. Then it's going to be on autopilot. So it can be effective if you're experimenting with doing different letter combinations, and it's hard for you to focus on more than one letter at a time. It can be helpful for running a letter in the background while you're facilitating or doing another practice or meditative art. Yeah, there's infinite possibilities with using the living crystal device.
Yeah, what I can add to that is a technique I like to use is I use the living crystal to generate a certain energetic form. Okay, that energy builds up. I play with that for a few minutes. Then I turn the device off and I work on amplifying the amount of energy generated to the same level. When that begins to fade, whether that's through pranayama or better focus, what have you. Once that begins to fade, I turn the device back on. And I like to flip back and forth. Another thing I've experimented with is using the device during one practice session and then not using it in the next. This provides a kind of stress adaptation cycle where you boost everything up, you recover for a day or two, then you boost it up again. That seems to work exceedingly well. So again, that's why I like that analogy with barbells, where you engage in the training stimulus, your body recovers, and then you do it again. So yeah, it's extremely effective for that. Next question. Can TLC help enhance one's mental transference skills?
Yeah, absolutely. It can help with the mental transference exercise. Besides IAH, it works across, and at any point you need to work on a concentration exercise or have more concentration, then simply running the living crystal device and spending even a few moments with it can make a huge difference. One of the biggest obstacles that we face on a day-to-day basis throughout everything else that's happening around us is that there's so much static in our environment and at work, between loved ones, relationships. So there's constantly things that are not facilitating or helping you be more meditative, more concentrated, or equanimous. So when you work with living crystal device, it can be an anchor for you to have that and to, again, have more mental transference in other areas of your life. Now, going specifically to a mental transference exercise, where, like, say, samadhi or having a single point of focus, it's very easy to use the living crystal device and focus on the living crystal itself, or the object that's placed on top of it, or the object placed under it, and focus on that. Or you can focus on concentrating instead on a single object. You can also use it to bridge into concentrating and assimilating with the field effect of the living crystal. So you can then learn to concentrate on frequencies and feeling and your other sense gates effectively. So it also bridges into these other areas. So the next question adds to like whether like how many living crystal gadgets would be like most optimal. And I think Bob, you made a really great analogy where with resistance training, where the more weights you put on a barbell, the more strength gains you get, respectively. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I've experimented with up to 5 of these one time, which was a little bit much, to be completely honest with you. Now, let me start by saying that the worst of negative effects we found with the device to date have been someone leaving it on overnight while they're sleeping, and they wake up in the morning with a slight headache. As its most pronounced effect is to expand that mental energy, mental sphere around you. If you do this for an extended period of time, or what I like to refer a very high velocity, that can be a little uncomfortable. Headaches, usually the worst of it. And again, this isn't a migraine, it's just a very mild thing that sometimes happens. Now, what I have done is I've put 4 of these devices in the 4 corners and then placed a 5th device in front of me to work with directly. Now, what I did in this is a take upon the equilibrium exercises from the Golden Dawn or from Franz Barden's system. So the 4 devices that I put in the corners, I established earth, air, fire, and water energy with to create equilibrium in the space. And then I focused on the single device in center. This greatly enhanced the results for a given exercise I was doing. And it created an interesting kind of containment effect upon the area that I was in. And the room that I was in was about 2 to 2.5 meters square. So it was a pretty decent sized space. What I've also done is put 4 devices in the corners and put the same energy into each one of them. And this resulted in a very high velocity or amplitude of whatever energetic form I was working with. In terms of what's optimal, I'd strongly advise working with a single device initially, just so you can get used to it and see how it influences your practice. Having more of these, of course, allows for a higher amount of energy. But what I found was that when I was working with multiple devices, it took me a month or 2 to become acclimated to that amount of energy. So again, it's like any other form of exercise, basically. If you get up in the morning on day 1 and do 200 push-ups, you're going to be pretty sore for about a week afterwards, and probably not progress as well as starting with 30 push-ups and then 35 push-ups and then so on and so forth. So did that answer your question?
Awesome. Well said. All right. Another good question. So after practicing with the living crystal device, is there any clearing the space or banishing needed in the room? And what would happen if someone didn't?
As a general rule, anytime you generate a large amount of energy in a space, it's a good idea to clear it out afterwards. Now, there are some exceptions. In my personal practice space / temple, when I'm done, if I'm doing evocation or invocation, I will make an attempt to clear the space afterwards. But if I'm simply dealing with one energetic form or another, I just leave it there. Now, every once in a while, the energy will start to feel a little bit dirty for whatever reason. And then I'll, do the normal thing of dusting the room and, washing the floors and doing that kind of thing. And that seems to take care of it pretty well. Keep in mind, as an energy amplifier, it really has to do with the kind of practice you're engaging in. So if you put one of these, say, in your personal gym space to help out with your athletic performance, I just leave it there. I don't think there's an issue with that. On the other hand, if you're engaging in practices like physical evocation, of course, you're going to want to clear the space out comprehensively afterwards. So I would say it depends. with the normal suggestions involving just good housekeeping. You know, when a room gets dirty, you have to clean the room. I think that works pretty well. Jake, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think personally, the only times I need to clean or cleanse things, it's like, so if I go to a crystal shop and I buy a crystal, and for whatever reason I pick up the crystal, and then through psychometry, or just sometimes you walk into a store or a place and it feels a little grimy, there's karma to the business that's not in synchronicity with the practice I'm going to be using crystal for. So in that case, I need to clean the crystal for sure. What I may do is I may soak it in water overnight, and allow that water to absorb any residual energy that might pass through that crystal when it touched hands through humans, and through that business. Sometimes additionally, if I feel it's really sticky, then I might also put some salt rocks or some salts into the water as well to really sap any negative energy that's there. Additionally, I might do some prayers, or might do some charging of said crystals to wipe it. Usually I just use water because it's the easiest. And then I address it the next day, and then I charge up the crystals with some positive energy, with some intent. And then that to me has been more or less my focus when I have done banishing or clearing. With the base unit device itself, I've never had to cleanse it or anything like that. So yeah. And then as far as like my energetic space around me, I've taken my living crystal device to a few different environments. Some environments I don't feel like I would want to have it out. Like when I took this to a crystal shop, and the crystal shop had a kind of grimy energy, I felt uncomfortable with having a living crystal device there. And I felt like it picked up a little bit of that energy, but then I just did a clearing exercise. Even just whipping air by it can dilute a little bit of that residual. So, and then also just then practicing with it thereafter, started cleaning, cleansing, and working with good intentions. I mean, all these things, process clear, working with having sage, good smells. Yeah, there's so many different ways to cleanse and to work with this.
The only thing I would add is if you're going to physically clean the device, the living crystal itself is not water resistant or waterproof. So, and the coil is electrically powered. So I would just advise using, you could use a damp cloth on the body of the device. But if you're going to try to clean the internal crystal, because it's not removable the way it's built, I would just use a dry cloth, for what it's worth. Definitely do not submerge it in anything. That will result in it not working very quickly.
Thank you for the reminder, Bob. That's helpful. When I mean the crystals that you place on the top.
Great. What happens when using sound generated by external devices, or by your own uttered sounds? Are they also amplified? Jay?
Yeah, especially if you're working with a mantra type practice, whether that be like a traditional yogic mantra, Kabbalah, or just reciting a prayer over and over. Working with the living crystal will amplify that effect. Now, specifically for Kabbalah, which is something I practice in a mantra kind of way, definitely helps with the amplification of that effect, and it quickly gets me into a state of trance related to the energy, the frequency, or the feeling or sensations that I'm working to tune into. So I drop into it much quicker than if I were saying that said mantra on my own. I noticed this amplification happening many times over, where it's instant, because sound is very, very powerful. And working with the sound, in addition with this living crystal device, it plays very beautifully and harmoniously. I find that, let's see, any external devices? Let's see. Yeah, I think I've left my living crystal device on by accident whilst I was listening to pop music, like kind of like some 80s synthwave, new wave. And I did feel more energized for whatever reason. And then I was like, oh, why do I feel all energized? And then I looked under my desk, and I was like, oh, okay, my living crystal is still on. And I turned it off. And I felt the music. I was like, all right, the music's still good, but it definitely amplified that sensation. Now that's a very mundane application of the device. But anything to add to that, Bob?
Yeah. We've had some people experiment with playing Buddhist sutras in the background while they conduct their meditation, and music produced or sound produced by mechanical sources does get a bit of an amplification. On the other hand, sound produced by a living being who has breath has a much stronger one. And again, that seems to indicate that if fed a little more astral or sensation-based energy, the device seems to amplify that somehow, which is very curious. But yeah, external sources absolutely work. And as Jake pointed out, it's an amplifier. So unless the stone you're working with has a particular purification effect associated with it, you're going to get more of whatever you're putting in. And that has resulted in some comedic side effects occasionally that we won't get into too much here. But an imaginative individual can figure out how to use this for a variety of purposes.
Indeed, indeed. Let's see. Here's a curious question, like, are living crystal devices environmentally friendly?
Yes, actually. We have a variety of them available in wood, ceramic, and plastic. They're manufactured using current manufacturing best practices. So in terms of an electronic device, they're about as simple as you get. There are no esoteric materials used in their construction. So now the one thing you can do is you can use a rechargeable lithium ion battery if you like, and that'll save you a little bit of money over a long period of time. Some people do have some concerns about how lithium is mined and processed, but there's nothing in here that requires the use of anything endangered or particularly exotic. It is simply an interesting take on some very old technology that probably goes back to the time of the Egyptians. But we're doing this on a micronized scale, whereas they were doing this on an industrial scale.
Yeah, and so we talked a little bit about the process of cleaning the devices. So are there any maintenance requirements for a living crystal device over time?
Generally, no. To be honest with you, we're not exactly sure what the life cycle of one of these devices is going to be, but based off the simplicity of the electronics and our manufacturing standards, any given device you have, as long as it's not abused or dropped or otherwise damaged, should work for several years at a minimum. The circuitry involved is not terribly more complex than an office lamp. So however long your office lamp lasts for, chances are the living crystal will be good for. In terms of maintenance, as a user, the only thing you need to do is change the battery when it stops working. Depending upon the quality of the 9-volt battery used, most people report getting anywhere from 40 to as much as 70 hours of use out of the device per battery. So again, if you're using it a lot in, say, a clinical setting, like in an acupuncture studio, you're probably going to want to go with a rechargeable battery. If, on the other hand, you're using it for personal practice, even an hour a day, well, then one 9-volt battery could be good for up to 2 months. So yeah.
Yeah. And so, and what can people do to help go through the process of choosing which of the living crystal devices is best for them, like the wooden, the ceramic, or the standard?
It's largely a matter of personal preference. In terms of its energetic performance, there doesn't seem to be much of a difference, if any at all. What I would say is the wood is going to tend to absorb more of the ambient energy in the background, wherever it's used. The ceramic, less so, and the plastic version, even less so. So what is interesting is that classically speaking, plastic devices were considered energetically inert. They weren't considered things that could absorb an energetic signature of their own over a long period of time. It turns out the living crystal generates enough energy that we found some of the older base units, the plastic actually absorbed a charge. And that was really a huge surprise because absolutely nobody saw that coming. So other than simply your personal choice, I'd say any one of them will work just fine for any given application.
Okay, so John's asking, provided one can manifest the energies at an astral level, is there a way to manifest energies at a physical level?
What we found is that placing an 8-sided object on top generates almost exclusively mental energy. A 6-sided object generates much more astral than mental energy. And a 4-sided object, so like a 4-sided pyramid-shaped crystal, for example, or a cube, generates more of a vital type energy. And again, this is very curious because normally astral and vital energies are only associated with living, breathing bodies. So we're not quite sure what that mechanism is, but that seems to be the best way to do it.
Yeah. Do you have any methods of like storing the living crystal device when it's not in use, or do you leave it out in the open environment? What are some different ways or procedures people could treat their living crystal device, depending if they're using it more casually or in a temple space?
Right. In my temple spaces, I just leave it out. You know, those areas are pretty contained. I don't have to worry about it a whole lot. In my personal living space, I just power it down. That said, the device comes with a very lovely box. That's works quite well for storage. Now, this is made out of paper. You know, it's cardboard construction, but that works pretty well. I've seen other people use a padded or lined bag, and that helps provide a little bit of cushioning. The only thing I would say is if you're going to take the device anywhere, just make sure you separate the ball from the device itself and store them in separate places, because depending upon how you carry it around, the ball can bounce around and potentially damage the device if it's not, you know, held in one place. So I have a backpack, and what I do is I put the device in the main compartment and I put the ball in one of the front compartments, and that works just fine.
Yeah. And how does the living crystal device compare to other types of healing tools, meditation tools, like say just working with a candle, for example? Like how does it really do?
Other than Goma or fire-based rituals, like, you know, using candle, this is the only thing we've found that actually adds more I hate this term, energy into the mix. Uh, Most other meditative devices will allow you to tune your practice to a specific waveform. They'll act as a timer. They might be a light sound machine that helps, kind of put you into a state of trance or tune your brain waves to a certain frequency. But generally speaking, they don't add more of this stuff that we use in the process to the process. So that's the real difference with this. Now, I have had friends combine the living crystal with a Goma fire ceremony, and the results from that, as they said, were quite spectacular. So it is something that can be used as an additive to those more energetic practices. I have found that if I do pranayama around the device, it generates more mental energy than it would normally. So that's also another curious effect of using it. But the main difference is the living crystal adds more to the process. And most devices out there that I've seen really haven't done this. There are some things that I've seen with spinning magnets and a bunch of other type equipment that you can find out there in the field of radionics that seem to have an additive effect on some level, but they're quite expensive and they're hard to get your hands on. So the advantage with the living crystal is a big part of what we're doing is making this kind of additive technology available to the general public versus somebody who has $10,000 to, spend on a device that may or may not work. And also keep in mind the placebo effect. A lot of people have found that if they simply believe something's going to work, it does. And that's where the living crystal really surprised everybody who was involved with the project, because none of us expected this to work at all. And it did, which was really, 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 really surprising.
So, what are some thoughts about using the living crystal device in conjunction with, like with your plants or with children or pets or friendly, like family relationships, loved ones? So, how does this device work when working with other people, either as a healer or just to enhance people's well-being, reduce anxiety, stress? What are some ways people could apply this
In a healing
general?
environment, it's super effective. It really reduces the workload on the practitioner because you're directing the energy, and it's enhancing what you're personally producing. So for that environment, strongly advise. When it comes to working with loved ones in just in a general environment, what I caution people on is the nature of free will. It's very easy when you know how to do these things to control your environment and by extension, the people in it. What I will tell you is when people do that, even people with no training at all, who are not interested in esoterics or meditation or yoga or Reiki or energy work, they're incredibly sensitive to somebody attempting to manipulate them. And so my advice is don't. If it's an active thing other people are working on, or if you're using it to improve the ambience, say in your shop, or reduce your workload as an energy healer, Reiki practitioner, acupuncturist, body worker, those are all completely benign applications because people are coming to you for a given service. What I would say is, in terms of working with others, you always need to do it with consent. And while I'm not aware of any negative health effects of the device that would impact a child's development, they're not really capable of giving consent either because they're not fully formed human beings. So I would say, unless you're using it for healing or to help with an illness, I would say, yeah, you know what? Just being a better parent's probably a way to go. Jake, you have anything to add?
Yeah. I think, I mean, one curious thing I found is when using the living crystal device with plants, I've placed it in front of a few plants and tuned into the effect of that. And I noticed that when I connect with plants normally, either through mental transference or doing tree qigong or any type of meditative exercise with plants as living animals, beings, especially when it's out in forest or there's a cluster of different plants and they have their roots seated in the soil. I tend to notice that there is a field effect and that the consciousness of those plants kind of forms collectively. Even though each of the plants is individuated, there's also a collective energy feeling. What I've noticed with the living crystal device is when I introduce it to plants, that it kind of the plants themselves pick up on the living crystal and tune into it. And when I tune into the living crystal as it joins in with this field of plants, that also adds a very interesting effect of mental transference into this field of consciousness with the plants. When I placed it next to, say, like a house plant or plants that are more, they're not really connected with other plants because they're in a pot, I've noticed that they really enjoy it much more than say if I just place a normal quartz crystal into the soil of a house plant. I feel that there is almost like a toroidal field that is created, and the plant really appreciates having a living crystal device near it, either on the soil or outside of the base of it. Just having it in proximity seems to have a pronounced effect.
One thing I could
So,
add is if you're an alchemist or herbalist, placing one of these devices in your herb closet really charges up the effect of the medicine stored therein. Now, I'm not making a medical claim here. Please keep in mind, this is not an FDA approved device. You don't want to get into the whole radionics FDA debacle business. But what I can say is when I've applied the device to, say, spagyrics and just left it on for several hours for a few days, the end product was much stronger than it was without the use of the device. So that's very curious. So if you're into natural medicine or herbalism or anything like that, it certainly enhances the effects of those plant-based compounds.
okay, John asks, can any spirits attach or feed off of the living crystal device if there's any residual energy on it?
I would say no more so than any other item that has a lot of residual energy. So if you're talking religious iconography, say in a church or a temple someplace, some people have noticed that spirits tend to hang out around that a little bit more than than otherwise. What I would say is, again, depending upon the nature of your practice, clearing a room or establishing equilibrium or the four corners or the four towers or whatnot, or the four elements beforehand is good practice. And clearing the space out afterwards, if it's not something you want to leave generating all the time, is probably a good practice as well.
Yeah, and so if one is alone astral projecting out of their body, are there any dangers with the living crystal turned on next to you? So will that amplify the practice of the out of body astral experience, or would it hinder you? And I believe this is when they're saying, like, when there's a complete separation of the astral body, not like a mental projection, but like an astral projection.
That isn't something that I've worked with. My suspicion is that it would enhance the duration that you would be able to engage in that exercise, because as anybody who's ever successfully separated their astral body from their physical body will tell you, the process of doing that is quite exhausting. So I think it would enhance the duration of the exercise. It is not something that I've worked with much. What I can tell you with mental wandering, where you separate your mental body from your physical body to go out to these different places, it definitely makes the process a lot easier because it just gives you more energy to work with. The only thing that I would say is a distraction of that is the device does generate light. Some people are very sensitive to having light on and prefer a completely blacked out or dark room when they engage in these kinds of practices.
Yeah. So what are some other ways the living crystal device can be used for spiritual growth or even personal growth for that matter? Can it be used to enhance creativity and improve productivity or help with anything related to enhancing intuition, psychic development, doing lucid dreaming?
Again, as an energy amplifier, it's going to make most of these things easier. One of the things that isn't very well understood in metaphysics is the role of the thing that powers these processes. Whether you're talking vital energy because you want to engage in the miracle of the smashing of the bricks with iron palm practice, or you want to engage in energetic healing, which is more of an astral level effect, or simply mental wondering, something has to power all of those processes. And while we have various techniques that do this, everything from posture holding to mantra to pranayama, you name it, the fact of the matter is you still need something to push that process forward. So what I would say is if you look at the living crystal primarily as an energetic amplification device, you can then apply that to whatever it is you're trying to achieve to see if it works, if it's going to enhance what you're doing.
And would the living crystal device enhance any sigils or symbols associated with mastery of a meditation exercise or a framework for spiritual development?
We've had excellent results with simply placing sacred geometry or sigils just on top of the device and even near the device at its base. And people have gotten really good results from that. It seems to make whatever energetic form those are generating much more potent. So yeah, my suspicion is for that particular application, it would work very well. And again, using sigil magic, it's an interesting experience when using the living crystal, because you can do it either using one of the shaped 4, 6, or 8-sided shapes on top of the crystal and simply placing the sigil next to it, or just putting the sigil on top of it. Either way, it seems to work pretty well.
Here's a curious question I have about where do you see yourself being able to differentiate a genuine living crystal device and potential future knockoffs? What are some ways the living crystal devices we have will have a unique key advantage?
Primarily, it's in our manufacturing process. We're very specific about how the design, how the device is designed and implemented in manufacturing. As people like to say, the sequel is never as good as the original, and I'm sure that will be true. We are working on a series of patents and trademarks, so hopefully we can, try to make sure that the devices are properly manufactured. That said, it's technology. And at a certain point it will get out, and at a certain point people will figure out how to do this as well. That said, we are working on a series of follow-on devices, at least one of which will be released at some point. The second stage device. The third stage device involves the use of a Tesla coil, and until I can figure out some way to safety proof that, we'll be holding that in reserve, because the amount of energy it generates, energy, seems to be at least 10x what this device does. And at that point, it's very easy for people to become overwhelmed, and we don't want anybody getting hurt. Additionally, I made the mistake of getting too close to one of those once, and it generated surface burns on my right hand. We're not exactly sure how that happened because in theory that shouldn't have happened at all. So clearly when you really rev the motor up, you get an effect that we don't have good explanations for. That said, the stage 1 devices, as we're selling in the Kickstarter right now, are perfectly safe and don't generate any of these kinds of problems at all.
Yeah. And so what's a way to check that your living crystal device is an authentic one, right? That it's not a knockoff in future. Has that a process we've worked over?
No, actually, that's something we're working on. It'll probably have to do with markings internal to the device and the sourcing of where some of the subcomponents come from. Obviously, for trademark and copyright reasons and things involving patents, I don't want to get any more into that. But suffice to say, we will have a way of determining where and by whom all of our devices are created.
Yeah. And what are some ways you envision the living crystal device being used to help people with their emotional, mental well-being?
Sure.
Maybe for some people who are new to meditation, yoga, and mindfulness practices.
Right.
Like, what are some introductory?
Right. Every device is going to come with 2 instructional blocks of material. One, the secret smile type exercise, and another one is a take on the build the ball exercise. This is kind of the doorway to a lot of esoteric practice, because as it turns out, training clairsentience, or your sense of sensation or touch, is one of the fastest ways to engage and learn the meditative process. Because it provides you more of what you need to do these things, it lowers the bar for practice, so people aren't having to spend weeks at a time to get a base level effect. So when I first learned Tai Chi many moons ago, my Tai Chi teacher said it took 3 years for people to be able to feel the energy. Well, if it takes 3 years to learn how to do something, most people probably aren't going to do it, because let's be honest, they have lives, they're busy, they've got other things to do. The living crystal, on the other hand, it can take anywhere from a few moments to maybe a week at most. So that's a huge leap forward in creating an audience, or allowing a much broader audience to engage in these practices. And so that's ultimately where I'd like to see it go, is it become a standard piece of equipment that many people use to enhance their learning experience. And the fact that it enhances the results as well is just really an added bonus.
Yeah, fantastic. So we're getting close to the top of the hour. So if any of our participants have any more questions, this would be a great time to enter them before we start gradually hopping off. For now, I'm curious, has anyone been practicing and using the living crystal device for balancing their chakras, or for like spiritual purposes that are more yogic in nature?
Absolutely. Yeah, we've got a few beta testers out there, and they've all reported that it takes them a fraction of the normal amount of time it would take to get into that particular energetic form. Whether it increases their ultimate results or not, verdict's kind of out on that, but it makes the process of tuning into what they're doing and dropping into that state much easier. And that in turn saves time. So if you can get done in 20 minutes of practice what would normally take you an hour, well, this now allows you to do other things. And so, like I said, we're going to have fun over the next few years figuring out exactly what the limitations are of this technology.
Fantastic. And have you noticed that the living crystal device can be used in conjunction with allopathic and homeopathic therapy to help people in the process of healing any physical ailments? Has that?
Yeah, I have to tread a careful line here so we don't get into the whole medical claims business.
Mhm.
What I can say is that with spagyric and herbal compounds specifically, the effects of a compound that have been charged by the living crystals seem to be much more pronounced. And that's all I can say without running afoul of the various regulatory folks out there. So I'm not making a claim as to the treatment of any specific illness or a physical problem.
Yeah. Do you reckon that it could be used, it could be helpful in conjunction with allopathic medicine for someone who might be going through some type of treatment process as in conjunction, like in the same sense, meditation or Reiki or another type of alternative medicine might be helpful?
To the extent that it provides you more energy to do things with, absolutely. To the extent that it helps your sense of mental well-being when combined with the proper techniques, absolutely. And if you're going through a serious illness and you're tired all the time or you're depressed, hey, that's a big deal. Just that change in mindset alone in many studies is shown to be incredibly helpful. So that's as far out on that limb as I can climb, I'm afraid. But I would say that in terms of your overall energetic levels and your sense of mental well-being, when combined with the appropriate technique, it's absolutely effective.
Awesome. Awesome. So we're at the top of the hour now, and I believe that was the last question. So for now, I'd like to thank everyone who showed up for our presentation on the living crystal device. The Kickstarter is still live and going well. We've well passed our threshold and our goal, and we're excited for more people to join in on this really exciting and revolutionary project.
Yeah, this video will be posted on YouTube and our various media. If you go down to the text portion of the video below, you will find links to the Kickstarter, links to 60 Skills, my program, links to Jake's program as well. And if you have any questions or want to learn a little bit more, just reach out to us. And we really appreciate all the support. We've had a wonderful experience with the community so far and really look forward to great things to come. So Jake, thank you for joining us today. And John, thank you for showing up and asking such great questions. And I hope to hear from everybody soon.
Great. Thank you, Bob.
Not a problem. Train hard and be well.